Kate Floss, SOS, England, Scotland, Ireland, well, Protestant England, not the rest of England, Protestant England, Protestant Ireland, Protestant Scotland, not those Jacobites, SOS, Australia is under attack, New Zealand is under attack. Now, you might not really, if you come from those countries, understand what Kate Floss is talking about, but you've got to keep an eye on New Zealand. Now, our whole story is going to evolve here if you keep on watching. A huge story is going to evolve where you're going to find out that God is in the sperm. And whenever we have the countries need to do intercourse with each other in order for the world to prosper and for us to produce fruits and produce resources that we want. The countries need to intercourse with each other. The countries intercourse with each other through kings and queens. Now, the kings, the man is the man. God is the sperm. Where is God created? Right down there in the ball bag where the very sperm is created. That's the Father right there. That is God. But hey, the sperm can't produce anything by itself. It needs to have intercourse, and then it matches with the female, and then that is the female that produces the fruit. So the man produces the seed, and it's the female that produces the fruit. Well, it's the same with when the countries are doing intercourse with each other. They need a male king and they need a female queen. He is the God man and she is the fruits woman. Now, England for the last previously Germany was going over to England, and the kings of England were intercoursing with Germany, right? And the Germans were entering into England, and then when Queen Victoria, so this going to be a bit of a story. It's kind of a bit hard to tell you this. So in 1820, there's a company called the King's Bench Law Company, which was run by a man called Henry Butterworth. Now that was 1820. And at that time, Queen Victoria was born, and she was destined to be the fruit of the male seed. All right. Now, Queen Victoria, upon her birth, Henry Butterworth's nephew, and I can't remember his name right now, but I'll go and look later. I'm going to do another story on this, but this is just a quick review because I'm talking about the Nelson tents. So, but I just need to do this little background to bring in England. The Queen's Bench Law Company was the nephew of Henry Butterworth, split from him in 1820. That actually started with him in around about 1815 or something, or even earlier than that. And then upon the birth of Queen Victoria, the two Butterworths, the uncle and the nephew, split. And the Queen's Bench Law Company was birthed in 1820. Now, in 1835, so we had our 1688 Bill of Rights. In 1835, both Scotland got a Declaration of Arbroath and New Zealand did a Declaration of Independence. Now, those two declarations was set up by Catholics and Jewish missionaries, and they were set up under King's Bench, whose King's Bench still had quite a lot of control at that time. And so what we had was a King's Bench law company and a Queen's Bench law company. Upon the death of the King, King William IV, upon his death, Queen Victoria, 17 years later, in exactly the year 1837, Queen Victoria ascended to the throne under the Queen's Bench law. Now we had a queen, and who was the king, which was the sperm of God? Well, he was King Wilhelm Augustus over in Germany, who was the king of all the United Kingdom. So we had King Wilhelm over in Prussia and Queen Victoria, the fruits, over in England. That was exactly in 1837. Now, we're going to be talking about these tents. Oh, I get a bit hot here. Hang on, I'll just get this thing dry my face. Now, I'm just trying to figure out how I'm going to try and bring you all in. So we want to reach a place of 1839 is what we want to reach. Now, I did do a video on the Facebook that I told you at that time, previous to 1820, in 1815, a paramount chief called Taraupara and a paramount chief called Waikato, they, in 1815, went over to Australia. And as you know, what does God say? God says, first came the word. So Taraupara and Waikato went over to Australia, and they created the first Maori dictionary that only had the vocabulary. They recorded all the vocabulary, but they did not record any of the grammatical form of their vocabulary, but only the vocabulary. Every vocabulary that they could think of went into that dictionary, and there wasn't much vocabulary. Now, those two come back, and then in 1820, Hongi Hika, a relative of theirs, he goes over to meet with a man called Samuel Lee at the Magda University. At the Magda University, he meets up with a man called De Tyrie, the French guy, right? And then Samuel Lee, the French guy, and Hongi Hika, all together, they create a new dictionary in 1820. This is the second dictionary. Now, this dictionary was Samuel Lee translated and inserted all Asian language come from the Sanskrit, and he's inserted certain vocabularies from the book of Jacob, certain vocabularies from the book of Peshitta, and one of those is Catholic, and one of those comes out as Jewish, I think. But anyway, and that was when they created the grammatical texts and the grammatical. They were not able to completely write about the grammatical text of New Zealand Maori, because apparently it was so complicated that they weren't even able to translate it into any other language, because it was so complicated. One of the most difficult languages that he had ever had to deal with, Samuel Lee reckoned. So they managed to put together this 1820 book. Now, this is just going to show you how these New Zealand natives were working together with England and with Germany, the kings of England and with the Queen. So 1820, we've got the King's Bench Law Company and we've got the Queen's Bench Law Company by the uncle and the nephew sitting side by side under King Henry VIII or something like that, right? King Henry VIII's charter or something like that. So let's see, let's go to 1835, the Whakiputanga and the flag. Now, if you look at that Takara flag, I'm going to throw it out on an impulse here that I believe that flag is French, German, and English all combined into one. And if you think about what was going on over in England and with Hongi Hika and with Te Raupara and with Marsden, we had the Catholics, we had the Germans, and we had the English, and we had the French. There's a whole big party going on amongst all of them over there, right? So that's what I believe that flag is. Now, around about 1835, Te Raupara was not the paramount king. Te Raupara had an older brother. So obviously the older brother would have been the kingly one and not the younger brother. So apparently Te Raupara's older brother had a son called Tenati. Tenayti. You'll know from a guy called John Dunmore Lang and his four letters, that Tenati had a mate. So around about now, it's a bit nefarious about the time frame that he is supposedly found over in France. But Tenati and his friend, between, I would say, 1835, but definitely long before 1837, were sent on a ship over to France. Meanwhile, a man called Diefenbach is over in Germany, and he is a native German fighting against the Catholics and the Catholic rule, to my understanding, but I need to still look out of that. He gets sent out of the country. He must have come from a royal family, and I believe that he was a native. He gets sent out of the country, and he meets up. He gets exiled in Switzerland, and then right in 1837, he ends up in France with Tenati. So we've got Diefenbach, Tenati, and Tenati's mates. And this is in exactly 1837. And in exactly 1837, the king dies. Now, Diefenbach was waiting on the border of Switzerland. And then the king over in England dies. Queen Victoria ascends to the throne in 1837. And then Wakefield from the New Zealand Company miraculously turns up in France, finds Tenati, finds Diefenbach, and they all escape happily. Here's Tenati up on my wall. He's been given a special place up on my wall next to Tamati Wakanene. So they go on a ship to England. When they get to England, they purchase the ship, the Tory. Now, when they purchased this ship, the Tory, this ship was not a British ship. Tonighty was a native New Zealander, and he was recognised, that I've just read, by Norman B. to Hobson, that they were recognised as the sole owners of New Zealand, and they had the whakiputanga to say that they were a self-governing country. But that ship was purchased, and they put Tinaiti on that ship, and they put the Takara flag on that ship. Which law do you think that ship was governed under? It was governed under New Zealand Native Chief law. Now, Diefenbach chats with Tinaiti, and he learns all the New Zealand native language on the journey. Now, wait. Tinaiti and his mate spend 2 years in England talking with Queen Victoria, meeting with Queen Victoria, talking with Diefenbach, getting all the laws explained to them. And Tinaiti's mate dies. Tinaiti gets on the ship in 1839 with Diefenbach. They both sail back together. And then I'm just reading from the Chatham Islands that the Queen Charlotte chiefs, everywhere they went, they had letters from the chiefs informing the chiefs of the places that they went to give them free passage and to help them in every way that they could. Now, in 1839, there was no money in New Zealand. And according to customary law, I didn't bring it with me, but there were land purchases made in the entire lower North Island called Port Nicholson. That's all the Shelley Bay area where they're all fighting about now. We've lost Shelley Bay. We're losing Wellington, right? They purchased all the upper South Island, Nelson, all of those places. Now, what had happened was, if you're wondering why I'm talking about the man is God and the seed and the woman is the fruits, Queen Victoria, while she was governing, King Wilhelm loses his kingship and his line is wiped out, and Queen Victoria is a fruit without a seed. Can't have it. Cannot have it. So Diefenbach, the New Zealand company, and the Wakefields did all of their purchases not in the monetary value. They did their purchases according to the laws of New Zealand, in exchange of goods. So they exchanged nails, copper, shirts, pots, knives, cannons, everything that they wanted was exchanged for each piece of land. And then included into the agreement was that the land would be, they would bring labourers in, which were the fruits. The land is the seed, and the people are the labour. They would bring in slave labourers to cultivate the land and build the infrastructure. And then the monies collected from that revenue would be shared. And then they would get 10% of that. So those were original land deeds, and the tenths was put into that land deed. All right. Now, 1840, on January the 14th of 1840, Queen's Law comes into New Zealand. It's going to be about an hour's video, I think. I'll try and make it short, 6:45. Right, Queen's Law comes into New Zealand on January the 14th, after all the land deeds had been done. The whole country had been sold. Then the New Zealand company, they've got no money, and they're not able to set up a corporation because they're not able to join these tribes. So now I better start getting my papers. So they bought the Chatham Islands, right? The Wellington District land deeds were called the number 1 original title, and the Nelson District land deeds were called the number 2 purchase. And then they were done on the 27th of September of 1839. On the 14th of January, the Queen's Law with Hobson came into New Zealand, right? And then the treaty between February and December or November, the treaty was passed, but the treaty was never passed in a court of law. The treaty was only a document that was passed to say that the Queen would govern over the Anglo people. Now, if you look at the treaty, you can see exactly what the treaty says. All it says is that the Queen Her Majesty the Queen will govern over the Anglo-Saxon people, the German people, and that the New Zealand natives were the sole sovereigns thereof of all the lands. That's what it says. All right. Now, in 1841, on the 12th of February, the New Zealand Company opens a joint stock company at Westminster, a charter of incorporation. That was done on the 12th of February of 1841. And then between 1841 and 1842, there were letters published in the German newspaper saying that those lands were going to belong as part of the lands of Germany and the German Empire. And they'd already been purchased on a New Zealand native title ship under New Zealand tikanga law. That's why they need tikanga law in the courts now. They were not able to bring this tense case into the court until they bring in the tikanga law, because those 1839 land purchases were done under tikanga law, and they were not done under British law or German law or any law, only tikanga law, which is called customary law of that country. In 1842, in February, in December of 1841, the New Zealand Company and the German government put letters in the Gazette paper of Germany saying that those lands were open to German immigration under German language and German law, and that's the German part of that flag. That's what was agreed. In 1842, by letters patent in February, the Queen Victoria announced that those lands would not be going to Germany and that Britain was confiscating them and taking them. That was in February of 1842. Now remember, there were no subjects in New Zealand, and there was no law by the natives who owned New Zealand, and so they couldn't have the Queen's laws were not able to be proclamated in New Zealand just yet. Wait on a minute. Now, in between February of 1842 and September of 1842, right? I have to go back to Tanaiti. Now, Tanaiti married Te Raupara's daughter, Rongitoha. Tanaiti was married to her, and some important things happened in 1842. February 1842, the Queen announced that Germany would not be allowed to take those lands that Britain was taking them. And then, in around about September of 1842, Tanaiti died. Now, keep in mind that Tanaiti is married to Rongipoa, or whatever her name is, who is Te Raupara's daughter. So he basically married his cousin, married his first cousin, is what he did. And Tanaiti dies, and not only that, Lord Normanby sends a letter to Hobson, and he says to Hobson, we want you to issue naturalization papers from New Zealand over to Germany to naturalize a bunch of German people before they come to New Zealand. Now, the Queen was not able to naturalize them. They were Germans that hadn't even left their country that were to be secretly naturalized as German nationals before naturalization had even been created. This is the skullduggery that they were getting up to with these poor German people that they have trashed for hundreds of years. Now, I don't know if Hobson did naturalize those people in Germany, but what happened next? In September of 1842, Hobson dies. So Tanaiti's dead, Hobson dead. I suspect that when Tanaiti died, I'm wondering if it was a suspicious death, because at the time that Tanaiti died, now Tanaiti is on all of those original land purchases. And I suspect that when he died, Diefenbach did a runner. He took off to England. Now, we're going to be telling some more stories about this, so don't everybody quote me. I'm just doing my best to piece all this together so you can figure out what's going on and you can follow this court case of the Tents. So if you know all of this, you'll be able to follow that case without a problem. Now, so Hobson dies in September. In December of 1842, a man called Beer is given the okay to bring a bunch of German natives. They were not citizens of Germany. They weren't even nationals. On that ship were 5 Sixtus brothers. Those brothers were 18, 16, 14, 18, 16, 14, what's the other one? 20, 18, 16, 14, and 12. My 3G Grandy is the one that was 12 years old. So if the child was before 12 years old, they were considered not alive on the earth. They were considered to still be in the godly realm. And it wasn't until you were 21 that you were considered to be fully of age. Those 5 Sixtus brothers were all under. Now, that's going to be significant in a minute. Now, their mother, Sophia, their mother, their father had died, and their mother had married a man called Conrad Lang or Longy. Think David Longy, right? Think David Longy. So their mother had married to him. Now, there was quite a bunch of people on that German ship called the St. Pauli, and then it set sail with Beard as the captain. Now, you have to understand that the captain of a ship that belongs specifically to that country, a captain of the ship is under the laws of that country, and he administers them while at sea as if he was a king in his own right. The captain of the aeroplane, you have to do anything he says. When he's in international flight, you do what he says. He's the paramount king. That is the same for on the ship. So halfway through the voyage, they stop off in South America. South America. Now, that when they got to South America, there was a mutiny on the ship. And they made up all these stories about how cruel he was to the passengers. Now, interestingly enough, the letter that is written to write about the complaint of how cruel he was, half of the passengers' names were left off of it. And they said, we've left off these names because they will put in other complaints that we don't want to disturb our complaint. Be it who was going to New Zealand with the promise that they would all be going to the Chatham Islands and that they would have ownership of the Chatham Islands, ownership of Wellington, and ownership of the upper parts of Nelson, or maybe not. Yes, I think that was done. I know the Chathams. I think Nelson was given in exchange. So when this ship arrives in New Zealand, in South America, Beard is removed as captain, and another captain is put in charge. And the flag was changed from a German flag to a British flag. That is what happened. Or it may even have been changed for the Takara flag. But Beard is known to have said that if he had his way, it would be a German flag up in the left canton, which this area here is called the canton. So that's the canton. So he said it would be German. So they either switched it out for British or they switched it out for the Maori flag that was chosen in 1835. And they switched out the chief. There was a mutiny. When they arrived in New Zealand, now, here's getting the hairy, scary stuff. They arrived in New Zealand on June 1843, June 14. And before they were allowed to step foot on the shore, they were all made subjects of the Majesty. Now, everybody knows under subject law, we're not allowed to buy native land. The minute we buy native land, the title is extinguished. Not only is the title extinguished, then the Queen scoops it up from her subjects and takes it. Now, that 1839 deed was done under New Zealand law on a New Zealand ship. So that was all done under New Zealand law, nothing to do with Britain or Germany. And those Germans that did it with Tenaiti were not subjects. And so those Germans that were brought on that ship were not subjects. They were natives of Germany. And when they arrived, she made them subjects before they were allowed to step foot on shore. The minute that they stepped foot on the shore, she confiscated the Chatham Islands from them and any land deeds that they had made, because they were now deemed to be subjects. Now, in on June the 17th, 3 days later, the New Zealand company had been given Nelson as a replacement, and then they were mapping out the tents to give to the New Zealand Maoris that were there at that time. And as they were mapping out the tents, Te Raupara turns up with his daughter, Rongitoa. Now, Rongitoa had been married to Tanati, and Rongitoa, Tanati had died, right? And Diefenbach scoots it to England, and Rongitoa marries Bledisloe, a British-born man, and then a woman were not allowed to own land. So her land that she owned from the agreements, from the 1839 agreements, she gave it all to Bledisloe, right? Now, when there was this Wairau massacre, it was originally called the Wairau massacre, and then it was changed to be the Wairau affair, and then it was changed to be the Wairau affray. But in fact, it was a massacre. The Germans had realised, including Beer, that they had been absolutely screwed. They couldn't go back to Germany. They couldn't live in New Zealand. They had no land. Everything was just gone, and they were left in a cold, muddy swamp. So they went up to face Te Raupara, and Rongitoa got shot. And then 22 of, including one of the Wakefields, 22 of them have got shot. That was 3 days after the St. Pauli arrived. Now, after that, St. Pauli arrives, the Wairau murder. So Rongitoa, Te Raupara's daughter, is killed. Now, in 1844, in July of 1844, there was now a new a supplementary joint stock company, the joint stock company Union Bank in 1844. Do you remember I told you in 1843, all of those Germans were made subjects of the Queen? Well, they were made on that day, but it was not ascended. In 1844, that was ascended to the Queen, and then the joint stock company, remember the joint stock company that I told you that was created on 12th of February 1841? Well, that was called the Charter of Incorporation. Then the joint stock company, company Union Bank was in 1844 was ascended together with the ordinance of all of the names of those who had been made subjects, and that joint stock company was attached on to them. Only the St. Pauli, and I believe it was only attached onto, I believe that there were a bunch of them that were naturalised who were involved in the mutiny, called the Langs and the Sabrinskis and the Corbins and some other ones. And I believe that there were some of them who were not naturalised, who came in as native people who were not naturalised or citizens. They were only just native indigenous people of Germany. And so that joint stock company was attached onto them in July of 1844. On the 11th of July, the Union Bank of Australia was attached. And on the 16th of July of 1844, it ascended. So there's 3 dates on there. There's the 1843, on June 1843, June 14, when they were made subjects. The Joint Stock Union Bank of Australia that's attached to the 1841 corporation is on the 11th of July, 1844, and both of them are ascended together on the 16th of July of 1844. Now, however, I've missed a bit here. On the 21st of April, another German ship was sent. Now, this German ship is called the Skio. Now, in 1841, when the corporation was being set up over in England, right, the Skio went to Australia in 1841, and they set up a place called Klemzig in South Australia, Klemzig. That was set up in South Australia in 1841. This whole freaking thing was planned, right? So they went and set up a settlement over in Australia, right? And then now that St. Skiold ship turns up in New Zealand in the 21st of April. It left port. The Skiold left port on the 21st of April, 1844, and turns up in New Zealand in September of 1844. And in the middle of that, the Union Bank of Australia, right, which is attached of the 11th of July, which is attached to the ascension of the subjects on the 16th of July. So the St. Skiold set sail out of Germany, then they do that, and then it turns up in New Zealand in September, right? And then in that time, when it turns up, by that time, all the German settlers were absolutely devastated. Now you'll just see a new video by Mickey Forbes. I think it's Mickey Forbes or one of them. And she has said if the New Zealand natives didn't go and give food to those early settlers, they all would have died. Bull crap. They went and gave all the food to those settlers. That's what Tamati Wakanene and Patu Oni said. I'm now their father. And the reason why he did that is because they knew that all of those people there were there to create the system for them to set up the governments, to create the 125-year trust. None of it could have happened without that one St. Pauli ship that was duped into coming to New Zealand illegally. The whole thing was a huge scam. But, you can see that these chiefs have known exactly what they were doing all the way through. They knew. There's no doubt. You can tell from every step that they took, from the 1815 dictionary over in Australia to the 1820 dictionary over in England, to sending Tenaiti over to France, the meeting with Diefenbach, the ascension of Queen Victoria. There's a whole beautiful history going on here, people. Now, where are we up to? Now, so the latest video of her saying that the natives gave food to save them and they wouldn't have survived. Well, they were just trying to make penance for what they had done to the people of the St. Pauli. So they were trying to make penance. Now, in 1844, directly after the Saint Skio arrives, an Australian group turn around near 1845. So September, the Saint Skio arrives, and right on 1845. Now you need to remember this. Right on 1845, the Australians over in Clemzig make the offer to have any of the Germans shipped out, and they specifically wanted the illiterate and the unworthily, the worthless, dirty little creatures, which was the natives of Germany that had been stolen from Germany by the Jews and brought to New Zealand. They wanted those ones. They wanted the ones who had been given the subject status, who the Queen had then, so those subjects were the very first subjects of New Zealand, which enabled them to set up a court. No subjects, no Queen's court. And the Queen was not able to make English or Scottish or Irish people subjects on the soil of New Zealand, because they were already subjects. So they needed an empty vessel of natives from Germany to make them subjects on the soil of New Zealand. And that ship there, called the St. Pauli, they sank that ship. There's no records on that ship. They bought it, they brought them, they sank it. Skiold's the same. They brought it, it came in 1841 to Australia, another trip to New Zealand in 1844. There's nothing on them. Those group of people was scooped up and put on the Sister and sent to Clemzig in Australia. And the ship's list of the Sister has miraculously, you cannot be found. They will not let you see it. And there's all the ships list. This is 1845. It comes up that there is a ships list, but it's gone. And then those people in 1855. Now you're going to listen to the court talking about the 1845 Spain Commission. And the Spain Commission started in 1845, where they confiscated all of the Nelson area. Now, there was 200,000 acres given to the New Zealand Company in replacement for the German Chatham Islands. And the New Zealand Company did not accept the Spain Commission's ruling. And when the Spain Commission did it, originally there was supposed to be 200,000 acres, where a tenth of that was to be given to the natives. But when the Spain Commission came in and Queen Victoria came in, they lopped off 49,000 acres. And they only got 151,000 acres. Now, that particular tenth was not accepted. And if you're following my videos and if you're following the court case, I'm going to come back in and let you know. So we're at 1845. When I come in on the next video, I'm going to be talking about 1845 through to 1848. And I'm going to explain to you all about what this 10th court case is all about and how it's all going. So keep following for the next video. But I did just want to read, this one thing to you. What happened to the Germans later? Now, in 1855, those Germans were brought back, and they were brought back on the Maori. So if you're thinking about these ships, right? You've got the Tory, that is actually a New Zealand ship with a native New Zealander, and it's under native New Zealand customary law. Sitting with them is a native German Diefenbach. Now, in 1843, I'll tell you about Diefenbach later. Yeah, it's 1843, Diefenbach tried to get back into New Zealand, and they forbid him from entering. And they lied to the Maoris, the natives, and they told the natives that he was dead when he wasn't. Now, there's another story that I'll be telling you about that next time. But you can think about the ships. We've got the Tory, which is a native New Zealand ship under customary law. We've got the 1839 land deeds of Wellington, the Chatham Islands, that were bought by Germans who were native Germans who were not subjects. It was a native to native deal. And natives, I've got a feeling that there was a land exchange also done. Oh, I forgot to tell you. Well, I'll come back to that. That joint stock company, I better just tell you now, that joint stock company, that joint stock company, I forgot to tell you, on the 26th of February, on the 26th of February, that you remember that I told you that those lands were purchased by an exchange of trade, because that's how the Maoris worked, by an exchange of trade. Well, in 1841, after the Queen's Law had come and after the New Zealand Company had gone to create the corporation, on 26th of February, which was a couple of weeks after that corporation was done. So the corporation was done 1841, 12th of February. On the 26th of February, 1844. Oh, okay, right. Just come back a minute. On 26th of February, 1844, this is a big year, a final £300 was paid to the natives. Now, that joint stock company, you were allowed to pay, it was £25 a lot, and you were allowed to purchase up to £300 was the limit of the lots that you could buy. So you could buy 6 lots at £25 a go, up to 300. Well, £300 was given in a supplementary charter of in 1844, 26th of February, a supplementary charter was given of £300 to the native chiefs, to Nati and all of his crowd, and that went into the joint stock company, right? And then in July, that is when it all came together. In July, the joint stock company Union Bank was attached to the German people who were natives and made subjects in New Zealand at the port before they birthed onto New Zealand. They were then birthed onto New Zealand, and then that ordinance ascended on the 16th of July. And then the St. Scared came in September of 1844, and 1845, they were all scooped up, all the poor ones that couldn't read, they were scooped up and put on a ship and sent to a concentration camp called Clemzig over in Australia. They were sent on the Sister, and then in 1855, they were sent back, and I'll tell you it's a very important reason why they were sent back. Now, I've got just 10 minutes. that's just a little bit of a review. I'll try and, if you read the next video, if you're up with me, you'll be able to follow the next video. But I just want to tell you something about when the war came to New Zealand in 1914. This is how I just want to read this little passage to you of how the Germans were treated in 1914 after they had been nefariously used to set up the whole country. The French armies were burnt. The war minister, aliens. This was during the war. It says here, British and right. We must be strong in Cornwall to a mother in Otago. It is the crisis. They were talking about over in the German war, and the brunt of the attack was borne by the British armies. So Britain knew that they were going to war with Germany, and so they set this deal up over in New Zealand. I believe it was all to do with this German land purchase. The war was not what you think it was. Then all those Germans, thousands of Germans were living in New Zealand. The war cloud looms heavier than ever, and it is an awful time for every one of us, wrote one woman. The awful tension existing since news came through of the German advance is apt to prove too trying for wives and mothers. British and Dominion armies fell back 60 kilometres, and the outlook seemed bleak. New Zealand soldiers were thrown into battle to help stop the advance by Germany. Really, their spirit is a thing to marvel, their cheerfulness in spite of all the mud and uncertainty, wrote Chaplain Ronald Watson. He was not the only officer who believed that the mood of the men was upswing. Watson. Another person wrote, the conditions are awful, my nerves are on edge, the mood of the men in the ranks seems to have been low. I'm tired and sore and heartbroken of this hellish life, wrote Private Ernest Painter. God knows when it will come to an end. The worrying sickness of the soldiers and the influenza virus that had hit them, just go down a bit. The French troops found themselves able to rally. After a week, the federal state attacked yet again, hurling itself towards the enemy on 15th of July in a gruesome struggle that would come to be known as the Second Battle of the Marne. London begged for more men from Wellington, so they were demanding more troops from Wellington. Wellington agreed. The blindfold. Now remember, Wellington was owned by the first Germans to New Zealand. The blindfold parliament was called for a swift session of only 1 week to pledge yet another swag of money to the army and to allow Prime Minister and Finance Minister to steam off once more to London. No new taxes were imposed in the lightning session, but the government granted itself the power to keep borrowing as much money as they wanted until the end of the year in order to go on paying for the troops and weaponry against Germany. The government also granted the power to impose what was called national service across the whole country, strengthening the grip of the state that was asked for by the National Efficiency Board. The state now could control as a conscript every worker in every industry essential to the public welfare, and German people of New Zealand were forced to go to war against their own country. The state now, the country that they had been stolen from and were not able to return to, they were absolutely devastated, and they couldn't even return to their own country because the Queen had stolen from them their nationality, their native status. They couldn't even go back. It's just evil what they did. There's never an ounce of thought for us. The essential to the public welfare. Ward, now you're going to hear Ward talked about a lot in this court case, told the House that such powers were needed for the preservation of the whole body politic in what he called this time of unprecedented trial. The government was given strengthened power to force citizens, not ask them, force the citizens of New Zealand to buy war bonds. Well, let's just remember that all those citizens of New Zealand were the white slaves that were imported between the years of 1840 and the years of 1914. Thousands and thousands of white slaves were imported to get them working, unbeknownst to them that a war was imminent. And they were forced to buy war bonds, and they were forced, and the country borrowed and borrowed and borrowed debt to which those citizens, not the Maori, those citizens have had to pay that debt all these years back, and it's not even their country, so they say now. It's not even our country, and we've had to pay all this debt, and then all this debt that they're making now is just more debt. My 4 generations of ancestors have done nothing but pay for the native Maori debt. The war was their war, nothing to do with us people. It was a Maori war, a Samoan and Maori war against Germany to get all the lands that Germany had purchased over in Samoa. You're going to be hearing more about this from me. There's more to come. I've got a lot to show you. Fortunately, I can't show you on here. French, where am I? So they were forced to buy the war bonds. Massey and Ward steamed away. The war minister left behind to hold the fort, stepped up conscription and imposed forced labour. New Zealanders were forced to buy war bonds, and they were imposed upon them forced labour, and the country borrowed billions of dollars, of which the New Zealand Anglo-Saxon people of 3 generations have had to pay back. The ballot boxes rattled, numbers came up, thousands of the unlucky were herded together, marched into camp, kitted out, marched onto troop ships and packed off as freshly swollen loads for the killing fields. The swiftness and the harshness with which the government once more drew the sword and waded back and forth into battle provoked newly bitter struggles on the home front, ending with passive resistance and riot. The struggles, as before, split the citizenry along angry lines of nationality, German, English, Irish, religion and class, Protestant and Catholic. This comes from the book called The Great War, and it's written by Stephen Eldred Grieg. Aliens. Nationality questions became so vexed that the government began a new wave of persecution of anybody thought likely to be an enemy. 12 regulations were gazetted in 1917 to tighten controls over enemy aliens, above all Germans and all Croats. It was, if you go and look at those ordinances, it is all Germans and Croats that were brought out between 1840 and 1845. They brought out shiploads of them, and then they used them against their own country. It is absolutely heinous what these New Zealand natives and what that British government and what that New Zealand government had done to the Anglo-Saxon people of New Zealand. And they continue to this day with this court case in the 10th. It is disgusting. The registration of the Registration of Aliens Act passed by Parliament later that year ordered all adult aliens living in the Dominion to register with the state. Police and other officials thus could know exactly who they were. They forced them to register, which is what they're doing with the censuses now, to see how many Germans are still alive and where they lived, should they be wanted. The Revocation of Naturalization Act was even more deeply threatening, for it gave the government, the power to take away citizenship from anybody who'd been naturalized, together with that of any of their sons and daughters, even those who had been born in New Zealand. So this is what they did. They brought them in on the St. Pauli ship, stripped them of their right to return to Germany, made them subjects against their will, attached them to the court so that they could create a court and bring the Queen into New Zealand. And then they just set about slaughtering them in wars that they sent them to against their own people. It's freaking heinous. The government rounded up enemy aliens and imprisoning more and more in violation. New Zealand was always in violation of international law, not against the natives, but against all of the immigrants that they had brought to the country to set it up, the lying bastards. The Hague Convention forbade warring states from keeping enemy civilians detained in a convict prison. So what had happened was all of these Germans that from between 1840 and 1845 brought to New Zealand were not able to ever leave the grounds of New Zealand and return to Germany. They were all rounded up and kept in prison camps, and their children. And that was against the Hague Convention because they were still German nationals. They still spoke the German language. They still had their German, and that was against the Hague Convention. New Zealand ended up with 300 people, mostly Germans, and they put it in its concentration camp on Somes Islands. And Germans were controlled more and more tightly in Samoa too. And the occupation territories placing under house arrest every man, woman, and child of the enemy nationality. Robert Logan, the military commander, next made up his mind to lock the lot inside a concentration camp, but the war ended just before the camp was ready. Now, not only that, they put those Germans on an island called Somes Island, and then they put artillery weapons on that island. And since there was artillery weapons on that Somes Island, it was considered a territory to be bombed. And then they put the German people on that island, hoping that the German planes would fly over and bomb them. That's just evil. So that's what this 10th case is all about. It's not as simple as what you think. Germany, meanwhile, had long ago freed all of its enemy civilians that were imprisoned in its own camps. New laws and regulations were used. Max Bornhold, a naturalized citizen, was interned when he was found out that he sent money to his wife and daughter in Germany. The mother and daughter had been visiting the homeland when the outbreak of war occurred, and they were unable to leave the country. Since they needed cash for their living expenses, Bornhold had sent some by way of the United States. The government revoked his citizenship. Richard Moths, a justice of the peace, former mayor of Petone, had to go and register as an alien. So, okay, just stop there. So that's what happened to Bornhold, and I assume that he was deported because he had sent money to his wife and daughter over in Germany who had been caught up in the crosshairs of the war. The government revoked his citizenship. Richard Moths, who was a justice of the peace, and he was also the former mayor of Petone, he had to register as an alien. What had happened during this wartime is all of the Germans that were associated with Tamati Wakanene, with Tanaiti, with Patu Oni, they all had the top positions in New Zealand, and they all during the wartime had their positions removed from them. And he had to register as an alien. Herman Wallerman, wine and spirit merchant, had been naturalized for 30 years, and he was then made an alien, as was another of the commercial established, Bernhard Borland. The Borland brothers, upon applying for a wholesale license, were told that they must drop the Imperial German Eagle, their long-standing and well-known trademark, from their wrappers. And they went to the court. They said, no man should be allowed, the court said, no man should be allowed to parade such a German emblem, growled the magistrate. It's an offence to the public. Bet the magistrate was a Jew. Forced labour began to be imposed on all of New Zealand's German natural people who had been illegally taken there by their parents. They were the offspring of the parents that had been illegally taken there between 1840 and 1845. And these were all their children who had to get naturalised, and they were all forced into labour for the New Zealand government and the New Zealand natives, and it was in violation of international law. International law pronounced Sir George Eliot ceased to exist early in August 1914, and yet they were still forced to carry on their labours. The speaker, weighing in such certainty, was not a lawyer but a wealthy businessman, appointed to look into what should be done with the Croats of Northland. A briefing document written by state experts spelled out that Sir George was wrong and that it was still clearly against international law to employ civilians on forced work. So they were all forced to work. But the government made up its mind to coerce any apparent enemy aliens, but they were in fact naturalized people who were brought to New Zealand and couldn't leave anyway because the New Zealand government had done that. Croats were rounded up after a new war regulations early in winter gave a legal stamp to what was more or less enslavement of free men, and set to work building all the roads and all the railways under armed guard that all you New Zealanders are enjoying today. Yep, that's how New Zealand was built. And now those freaking Maoris are down at the court again, asking for half a Nelson, the Nelson Airport, all built by the forced labour of the poor Germans that were sucked in, nobody was stolen from Africa. They were stolen from Germany, where they were stolen. New Zealand, you know, we'll look at New Zealand in a whole new light. They're not as squeaky clean as what they claim. Liars. Croats were rounded up after new enslaved of free men and set to work building the roads. The state thus was able to exploit the labour of 2,000 healthy young workers not liable for conscription and not wanted in the army. And then, oh my God, the state sequestered, or in other words, stole the property of people who lived in Germany. Shareholdings owned by 5 women in 2 chain store companies, for example, were seized in one blow. Alice and Ida Wallach, sisters living in Essen, were relieved of more than 27,000 shares together with 400 shares in Hellenstein's. Julia and Agnes Wagner, sisters living in Hamburg, lost more than 31,000 shares in DIC. The state was helped. They all lost. The state was helped in this work by a Christchurch periodical called John Bull's Register, founded in the middle of the war, which confiscated all the German people's stuff. They ended up in court charged with libelling big shareholders. Now, I want to get down to, I've got to fight your own fight. All right. Now, I'll go down a bit. I'll scoop that a bit. German chairwoman who scrubbed government officers were denounced by one woman citizen as a security risk since they might be undercover agents. A gang of leisurely gentlewomen and old gents in the seaside suburb of St. Clair in Dunedin brooded about Cargill Castle. The castle loomed on the cliff. The servants and members of the family living in the big house, although not German, were accused of being German. Vigilantes shouldering rifles and bayonets fixed one night marched up and encircled the house. The lady in the castle looked out, went to the front door and told the interlopers that her husband was away on his estate. She, her daughters, and the servants refused to open up, but the vigilantes attacked anyway. Loud blows echoed on the door and battered and smashed. The door gave way. Into the hall, the bedrooms, the cellars, the little tower surged the armed men. They invaded the sacred privacy of the ladies' apartments without warrant or authority of any kind, and they instituted a search from tower to cellar. They discovered nothing, and crestfallen, they slunk away. But I would imagine that there were rapes went on there when they're talking about they invaded the sacred privacy of the ladies' apartments. I think what they're talking about being the body of the woman. But in those times, they didn't use the word rapes. So I think angry patriots attack shops every year in every province at Rangitia. Churches were attacked and the Lutheran parsonage was burned to the ground, followed by the Lutheran church at Halcombe. Christopher Dirk's pastor had heard that the latter was at rest and kept close watch, but one night when his guard was down, the church was set alight. The two arson attacks were not written about. The Christian Lutheran Church, all the Lutheran Protestant churches were torched. The Christchurch Lutheran Church had been the centre of worship for Canterbury's Protestant Germans for 50 years, but the federal state had donated a peal of 3 bells weighing more than a ton cast in Berlin. This is the bells. The bells first chimed at Christmas Eve. What song did they ring out? On earth, peace and goodwill. The church was confiscated by the New Zealand government on the outbreak of war in an act of dubious legality. Given that it belonged to a religious faith, the Protestants, and not to the government of Germany, rumour about the bells began doing the rounds. Almost everyone came to believe that they had been cast from a French gun. It was a lie, captured during the Franco-Prussian War, which was a lie. It was actually cast by the government. The Vandals, working in the name of patriotism, Catholics, that's all the Catholics, made up their minds that the bells must go because they're an affront, and the government gave an approving nod. This is the New Zealand government. The bells were ripped out of the tower one wintry day and dragged to a foundry where they were melted down. The iron was found not to have come from a French cannon. German New Zealanders worked hard to bear the blows. Mathilde Bremer, wife of a country doctor, tried to joke with the children about the way she had become the victim of curses and swearing. Lean off my fence, you German cow, ordered one neighbour. Yeah, you German cow. She told the children that even in the home, these lying New Zealand Maori have stolen our history and claimed it happened to them, but it didn't. All of these things that they are claiming, in fact, happened to the Germans that were stolen from Germany between 1840 to 1845, stolen from Germany, and all of these things happened to them, not to the Maori. She told the children that they, even in the home, they must no longer speak German. She comforted a friend, mother of a Lutheran pastor, who had been stoned by an angry mob in the Rangitiki. Dorothea, daughter of the family, wrote years later about seeing the mother of the pastor. Her face, so he must have died. He was stoned to death by New Zealand people, Catholics. Her face was bowed in her hands, her thin body racked with convulsive throbs, and our mother Tilly was kneeling, arms around her. Now, here's the last bit of the story that I want to tell you. William Nimrod, ODT, which was a German name, he was a private in the Dominion Army of New Zealand, was not helped much when his family changed its name to Nimrod to try to hide that they were German. Fellow soldiers jeered at him for being German, and they bullied him and beat him up. He crossed the lines one day and gave himself up. So he was fighting for the Dominion Army, and he was so badly bullied by the other New Zealand soldiers that he simply threw everything down and walked across the line and joined the German army. Bless his soul. Fellow soldiers, he crossed the lines. Two brothers. Now, remember I told you the 5 brothers from the Sixtus family who were stolen from Germany and then brought to New Zealand illegally and then shipped out to Australia to that little German place that they'd set up by the Saints. Well, 2 Sixtus brothers who must have been the children of one of those 5 Sixtus brothers, 2 brothers from the Sixtus family, although willing to serve in the Dominion Army of New Zealand, told their officers that they would not fight against Germans or Turks, so they would do everything else, but they would not fight against their own people or against the Turks. They were willing to, they worked in an army cookhouse until the spring crisis, so they were prepared to do all the cooking, all of that kind of thing. When their superiors, now, this is the thing that you all don't understand. When those ships were brought to New Zealand, those people were made subjects of New Zealand, not of England, of New Zealand. They were bonded to New Zealand forever. And through their bondage, they were forced to go to war to defend New Zealand against their own country, which they were not permitted to go back to. So they worked in the cookhouse. When their superiors one day made up their minds to ship the 2 young men to the trenches where fresh flesh was now wanted very keenly. And the 2 German Sixtus boys said, "I wish to respectfully protest," wrote Bertrando Sixtus, "I am of more German blood than of English. My treatment in New Zealand in the year prior to coming here has certainly not tended to cause me to modify." So he basically said he hated New Zealand for what New Zealand had done to him and his family and the way that they were treated. Their churches burned down, their schools burned down, they were beaten up, they were stoned, they were raped, they were abused, they were threatened, forced to work on road gangs as slave workers. Martin Riggs, the clerk, upon finding himself balloted for conscription, went before the Army Appeals Board in Christchurch, saying that he would not go into the Army House because of the way his family had been treated. His father had lived in the Dominion for nearly 40 years, and he had been naturalised for 20 years. He had been a policeman for more than those 20 years. Yet he had been sacked with his discharge document marked conduct not satisfactory. He had been debarred too from getting any police pension. Rings said he would not go into the army unless his father was granted back his rights. The chairman of the board of magistrates said that such things had nothing to do with the appeals and that the young man would have to go into the army. I'm not going to go to the war. That's straight, said Riggs, bless his heart. Oh, aren't you? Answered the magistrate. The appeal is dismissed, and he was thrown out of the court and shipped off to fight against his own people, against his will. Then you'll carry me there if I go. I tell you, I am not going. The mother and father shouted at the board, the latter saying that the state might as well have locked him up on Soames Island, where they had locked up so many Germans that were tricked into coming into New Zealand between 1840 and, 1840 up to 1851, pre-Constitution. Anybody that came into New Zealand post-Constitution of 1852 retained their original nationality, and they came in as a secondary citizen of New Zealand. And if their citizenship was revoked, they could simply go back to their own country. If their own country went to war, they could simply renounce their citizenship and go back to their own country. But this is not the case for all those Germans that were tricked into coming to New Zealand pre-1852. They were stuck there. Welcome to the Hotel California. You can check in anytime you want, but you can never leave. This is what I'm talking about. The mother had shouted the former, adding that her son was not going to war. The magistrate ordered a sergeant to clear the threesome from the court. Talk about your British fair play was the last word from Rings. The Germans are fairer than that. German New Zealanders were left often impoverished by being driven from all of their jobs or being bullied into shutting up any shops that they had. I am poorer daily, wrote sacked academic George von Sedlitz. The outlook looked darker than ever. After nearly 4 years of war and 3 years of living somehow on nothing a year. And so now I'm just about to wrap up my last bit, talking about the Maori, this last bit. The Maori, New Zealand Maori, who the ones that stood by the Germans, also had varying feelings about loyalty to the British Empire. Volunteering had been lackluster from the beginning, as we have seen, and stayed scrappy. Only 2 or 3 iwi kept up any keenness for the struggle. Men who joined up tallied only about 4.5% of the whole population of Maori. Volunteering was most markedly weak in the Waikato of Tomitiwakanene and Patuoni and Tanati, but so weak elsewhere that the state kept seeking soldiers from the tropical colonies. 1 in every 6 men who served in the Maori battalion was a Cook Islander. So there you have it. The Maori battalion was not even the Maori battalion. It was the Cook Islander Battalion, because the Maoris, along with the Germans, didn't want to go to war with Germany. The New Zealand government borrowed millions and millions of dollars and set all those people to slave work to build all the roads and railways. And the ones that weren't set on slave work were put on Somes Island with military guns, waiting every day for a German plane of their own people to fly over. Conditions were so bad that people were escaping to try to get to the mainland to call out for help. They were beaten, they were abused, they were molested. It was absolutely heinous. Now, it's interesting to me that Soames is also on the Joint Stock Company. So that's I'm going to leave you. That's a long video. You can go and check in to the courts, which is about the tents, but we'll have to come in and make up another video to be continuing the saga of the tents battle for the tents of Nelson and the battle for the South Island, that they are now once again another blow for the poor German settlers. We have been beaten down and down and down, and they're just giving us another whack in a long line of decades and decades of abuse. It's disgusting. See you later. Thank you to the lovely people that have stayed with me for the video. Bless your little hearts. Bye-bye.